Evil doesn't always enter the world with violence. Sometimes it enters quietly, disguised in ordinary gestures. A handshake, a polite smile, a voice that sounds calm enough to trust. The people Christopher Berry-Dee interviews don't look like monsters. That is the first unsettling truth. They look like men who could stand behind you in a supermarket queue, ask you for the time, or sit beside you on a bus without leaving a trace of threat in the air. And yet, behind those eyes is a mind untouched by the thing that holds the rest of us together: empathy. You don't feel it right away. The room doesn't shake when they walk in. There is no aura of danger, no dramatic soundtrack. Just stillness. But it's the wrong kind of stillness. The kind that makes you realize you're speaking to someone who can describe murder with the same tone another person might use to describe a grocery list. Berry-Dee has spent years walking into these rooms, gray walls, metal tables, the quiet hum of recycled air, and sitting opposite people who have killed without losing sleep, without breaking down, without ever feeling the weight of what they did. These aren't men who snapped. They didn't lose control. They had nothing inside them to lose. A psychopath doesn't panic before the crime or after it. Fear belongs to people who feel consequences. Guilt belongs to people who feel connection. But when you speak to someone who lives entirely inside the boundary of I, you begin to understand how murder becomes nothing more than an action. Not a crisis, not a tragedy, not a cross they carry. Just something that happened and then life goes on. That's what separates Berry-Dee from most people who read about killers. He doesn't examine them from a distance. He sits in front of them and looks them in the eye. Not through books, not through case files, through conversation. And those conversations reveal something far more terrifying than blood, brutality, or rage. Emotional emptiness is far more dangerous than emotional intensity. Psychopaths don't enter the room wanting to be understood. They enter wanting to be in control. You feel it almost immediately, the way they watch your reactions, not your questions. The way they answer slowly, not because they're choosing honesty, but because they're taking the time to calculate which version of themselves benefits them most. They don't respond to truth. They respond to power. And that is the first rule Berry-Dee learned. A psychopath doesn't talk to communicate. They talk to use you. Every sentence is a tool. Every smile is bait. Every pause is a measurement. They don't ask, what does this person think of me? They ask, what can I do with this person? There is no intimidation in their eyes, because intimidation requires emotion. What you see instead is absence. A stillness so unnatural that the longer you sit with it, the more your instincts begin to whisper something ancient and wordless. This person can destroy and feel nothing afterward. And yet, they don't look broken. They don't look angry. Many of them look normal. That is the nightmare inside these interviews, the realization that evil doesn't need to look damaged to exist. It can be clean, calm, articulate, and perfectly controlled. Berry-Dee has met killers who laughed while describing their crimes, not because they were insane, but because the memory of control still amused them. He has met others who spoke without a single flicker of emotion, not because they were trying to hide the truth, but because they truly felt nothing. Nothing when they planned it. Nothing when they did it. Nothing when they heard the life leave the body in front of them. And this is where the world keeps making a fatal mistake, assuming that murder must come from rage, trauma, hatred, or mental collapse. But the people Berry-Dee meets aren't driven by too much emotion. They're driven by none. Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it enters the room, sits down, and speaks in perfect sentences. And that is where this journey begins, not with blood, not with horror, not with sensationalism, but with something far more unsettling. A human face with nothing human behind it. The longer you sit across from a psychopath, the more you start to feel the shift. Not in them, but in yourself. At first, you expect tension, maybe even fear. But what creeps in instead is disbelief. How can someone talk about killing a stranger, a spouse, a child, with the same emotional flatness as talking about traffic or weather? The mind struggles to process it, because we are wired to assume emotion is universal. But in that room, you are face to face with someone who proves it is not. Berry-Dee learned early that these interviews are not conversations. They're contests. The psychopath enters with one goal: to stay in control. They don't care how you see them unless your opinion affects their power. They don't want to confess. They don't want redemption. They want relevance, the feeling that they still matter, even in a world that has locked them away. And so they test. Not violently, not openly, but with psychological pressure. They study reactions like scientists study lab results. A raised eyebrow, a small laugh, a shift in posture. Every detail is registered, stored, and used. They don't need to intimidate you physically. They just need to know which emotional button makes you react, because the moment you react, they've already won. Some do it with silence, Long, deliberate silence that forces you to fill the air, to move first, to show uncertainty. Others do it with charm, a strange, practiced warmth that almost feels human until you realize it's just mimicry, a mask built from observation, not emotion. And then there are the ones who weaponize honesty. They tell the truth not to confess but to control the room through shock. That is the second rule Berry-Dee learned. Psychopaths don't just manipulate people. They manipulate reality. They tell the story in a way that makes them look clever, inevitable, misunderstood, or superior. They never describe the victim as a person. They describe them as a moment, a problem, an obstacle, a reason. The victim never has depth. Only the killer does. But the most unsettling moment in any interview is not when they describe the crime. It's when they describe themselves. Their tone sharpens. Their posture sharpens. Their identity expands. They want to be remembered, not as monsters but as exceptions to the human rule. A normal person looks back at a murder and sees horror. A psychopath looks back and sees achievement or mistake, never tragedy. If they weren't caught, they call it success. If they were, they call it miscalculation. Not once does the story shift to remorse, because remorse requires empathy, and empathy requires connection, and connection is a language they were never born able to speak. That's why people misunderstand them. We think they're broken. But nothing is broken. The machinery inside them works exactly as it was built, only differently from ours. They aren't missing logic. They're missing the emotional circuit that turns logic into morality. So when they talk about killing, it isn't dramatic. It isn't chaotic. It isn't haunted. It's clean. A sequence of events. A choice. An outcome. No weight. No echo. No empathy. That is what makes these minds so dangerous. Not rage, not instability, but the absence of emotional interruption. And as Berry-Dee watches them speak, steady eyes, steady tone, steady heartbeat, he realizes something that never leaves him. Some people don't feel what they did. Some people don't feel what they took. Some people don't feel the difference between life and death. Not because they're evil in a dramatic sense, but because they are empty in a human sense. And once you understand that, you stop asking, how could they do it? Because the real question becomes, what would ever have stopped them? There is always a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the mask begins to slip. Not because the psychopath feels guilt, but because they grow tired of pretending to have emotions they don't possess. It may happen when Berry-Dee mentions the victim's name. It may happen when he asks a question that requires empathy to answer. It may happen when the killer realizes he cannot manipulate the room the way he expected. But when it happens, the temperature changes. The performance flickers. And for just a second you see the real mind beneath the imitation. Some killers pull back into flat, mechanical speech, as if emotion were a language they don't want to fake anymore. Others become almost irritated, not because they feel exposed but because the conversation is no longer serving their ego. A few will suddenly go silent, letting the air fill with tension, hoping the silence forces the interviewer to move toward them again. Control is the heartbeat beneath every word, every pause, every look. That is the third rule Berry-Dee learned. A psychopath is not trying to be believed, they're trying to be dominant. Truth, lies, sadness, charm, these are all tools, not states of being. If pretending to be emotional gets them attention, they'll perform emotion. If coldness makes them appear powerful, they'll drop the act. They don't choose honesty or deceit based on morality, they choose based on outcome. One of the most revealing indicators is how they talk about their victims. They rarely use their names. They reduce them to functions. The girl, the man, the body, the problem, the object I dealt with. The victim's life, their memories, their relationships, their future, is erased in the killer's language as easily as it was erased in reality. To a psychopath, removing a life doesn't feel like removing a universe. It feels like clearing space. And when Berry-Dee brings up the consequences, the grieving families, the empty rooms, the birthdays that will never be celebrated, the killer doesn't react with pain or shame. He reacts with disinterest. Not hostility. Not pleasure. Just absence. A blank corridor where humanity should be. People assume that the most disturbing thing about murder is the violence. But the real horror is the casualness with which some people commit it. Violence is shocking. Indifference is inhuman. And it is indifference, calm, calculated, unshaken, that defines psychopathy more than blood ever could. What most people never understand is that a psychopath does not grow from their actions. They don't look back and see a line they crossed. There is no before and after. The murder does not change them. Their mind stays exactly the same, because the part of the brain that should have recoiled, shattered, or awakened never existed in the first place. And yet they're not chaotic. They're not wild. They're not consumed by madness. They don't scream, twitch, shake, or panic. They are composed, clear, logical, emotionally empty, but intellectually present. It is the combination of calmness and moral vacancy that makes them terrifying. Because if someone can kill and stay calm, what else can they do without hesitating? That is why Berry-Dee keeps doing these interviews. Not to glorify them, but to expose the lie society keeps telling itself, that killers must look broken to be dangerous. That darkness must come with visible scars. That evil must tremble under the weight of its actions. But the truth he sits across from again and again is this. Some people can destroy a life and walk away unchanged, not because they are strong, but because they feel nothing where a human should feel something. No guilt, no conflict, no moral scar, just continuation. And once you understand that, you stop thinking of them as insane. You start seeing them for what they truly are, humans without the part of the mind that makes humanity real. Not all psychopaths talk the same way, but they all reveal themselves in the same pattern. Ask them about themselves and they expand, detailed, confident, animated. Ask them about the victim and the world shrinks, vague answers, detached phrasing, no emotional texture. It isn't accidental. Their mind simply has no reason to store or replay the pain of others. The only experience that matters is their own. Many of them attempt to build a narrative where they are the misunderstood one, the product of a cruel world, a broken childhood, an uncaring system. And yes, some of those stories contain real trauma. But Berry-Dee learned early that trauma explains pain, not cruelty. Millions of abused children grow into adults who refuse to hurt others. A psychopath uses trauma not as truth, but as permission, a poetic excuse to decorate the void inside them. Others go the opposite direction. They don't hide behind excuses at all. They justify their actions in the coldest way possible. Logic. If they were weaker, that's not my fault. Everyone dies anyway. Life is meaningless unless you control it. Their words are not emotional arguments, they are philosophies of detachment. They don't want forgiveness. They want superiority. And then there are the ones who don't justify, don't explain, don't dramatize. They simply state. Murder to them was not emotional. It was an action. Something they did, like opening a door or buying food. No pride. No shame. Just completion. That flavor of emptiness is the most unsettling of all, because it doesn't even try to defend itself. That is the fourth rule Berry-Dee learned. Psychopaths are not defined by violence. They are defined by the absence of internal resistance to violence. A normal mind holds an invisible brake. Empathy, guilt, fear of causing pain. A psychopath never had that brake installed. And without it, violence is not a transformation. It is simply an option. You don't see rage in their eyes. You see vacancy. A stillness that doesn't belong to the human emotional spectrum. And when they describe the moment of murder, the story is never about the victim's terror, or the sound of pleading, or the horror of life ending. No, the memory they replay is their own state of mind. What they felt. What they thought. What they controlled. They watch themselves like the main character in a film, and everyone else is background furniture. This is why people struggle to believe psychopaths exist. We want to believe everyone has a conscience even if buried. We want to believe humanity is built in, not learned. But these interviews prove the opposite. Some people are born able to mimic humanity, not experience it. And mimicry is enough to fool almost everyone. The most dangerous killers are not the ones who looked evil. They're the ones who looked harmless, until the world finally demanded a conscience they didn't have to offer. Berry-Dee has spoken to men who killed strangers for thrill, and to men who killed family because they were tired of them. He has heard murder described as problem-solving, as relief, as curiosity, as entertainment, as inevitability. But never, not once, as tragedy. Because tragedy requires two things, guilt and empathy. A psychopath has neither. What they have instead is narrative. A story in which they are always the center. A story in which the victim never mattered except in the moment they were useful, as fear, as control, as object, as closure. And that is the truth so many people resist. Psychopaths don't kill because something is wrong with them. They kill because nothing inside them says it's wrong. One of the most unsettling realizations Berry-Dee comes to is that psychopaths are often caught not because they failed morally, but because they failed strategically. They don't stop killing because something inside them wakes up. They stop because something outside of them interrupts. A witness. A mistake. A pattern noticed too late. To them, the crime wasn't a sin, it was simply an operation that stopped working. There is no inner collapse. No spiritual reckoning. No emotional breakdown. just the cold awareness that the game is temporarily over. And yet, the world keeps expecting remorse to appear like a late arrival, as if prison will eventually unlock a hidden conscience. But remorse isn't dormant in psychopaths. It's absent. There is no guilt waiting to surface. There is no voice inside them whispering wrong. They don't grow shame in solitude. They grow strategy. Some use their sentence to reinvent themselves as tragic figures. The misunderstood loner, the victim of childhood, the product of society's neglect. Others become the intellectual serial killer, speaking in poetic quotes and dramatic reflections, not because they feel anything, but because mystique is their last form of control. And then there are the ones who don't even bother pretending. When Berry-Dee asks them what they would do with freedom, some don't hesitate. "I'd do it again. Just smarter." They don't say it with evil laughter or theatrical menace. They say it the way someone might say, "Next time I'll lock the door." That level of detachment is not insanity. It is pure emotional vacancy. Psychopaths don't wake up haunted by victims. They wake up annoyed by inconvenience. Even now, locked away, some of them still feel superior, not in spite of prison but because of it. To them, being studied, documented, interviewed, written about, feared, it means they still matter. Behind bars they have an audience. In their mind, that is a form of survival. Because here is the deepest truth. Psychopaths don't crave peace. They crave significance. If they can't have control through action, they'll take it through attention. If they can't dominate a life, they'll dominate a narrative. And that is why many of them talk. Not to confess, but to stay alive in someone else's mind. But no matter how articulate they sound, no matter how calm their tone, there is always a fracture in their story. The fracture is not in what they say but in what they never say. They never wonder what the victim felt. They never speak of the aftermath. They never mention the silence left behind in families. They never describe the pain they caused, only the power they had. The victim's life ends. The psychopath's story simply continues. And that continuation is the real horror. Because when someone can kill and continue living mentally unchanged, it means murder was not a disruption. It was an expression. Not an outburst. Not a loss of control. A manifestation of exactly who they are inside. That's what society still refuses to face. We keep asking, what happened to make them like this? But for some killers, nothing happened. There was no moment that broke them. There was only a mind that was never built to feel remorse in the first place. Not damaged. Not shattered. Just empty. And emptiness with intelligence is far more dangerous than rage with emotion. Because rage burns out. Emptiness endures. Some people believe psychopaths are unpredictable, but Berry-Dee learns the opposite. They are painfully predictable once you understand what's missing inside them. A normal person makes decisions through layered filters. Conscience, empathy, fear of hurting others, emotional memory. A psychopath moves through life with none of those internal brakes. What stops you from doing harm is instinct. What stops them is risk. Not guilt. Not compassion. Just calculation. That is why their stories are never about moral struggle. They don't talk about sleepless nights or haunting flashbacks. They don't speak of wrestling with conscience. Their only regrets are errors in execution. They don't regret the cruelty, they regret the consequences. Some killers openly admit it. I didn't lose control. I took control. I wasn't angry. I was efficient. If I could redo it without getting caught, I would. Those aren't slips. Those are truths spoken without emotional interference. And the more Berry-Dee listens, the more he realizes something chilling. The hardest part of psychopathy to accept is not the violence, it's the stability. These people don't break down. They don't implode emotionally. Their mind doesn't fracture from the weight of what they did. They stay steady. Their calm is not fake, it is organic. Because they feel no psychological injury from their own actions, there is nothing to heal. That is the fifth rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath does not suffer from what they've done. Only others do. That is why prison doesn't reform them. Punishment assumes an emotional system. But what do you reform in someone who never felt the wrongness to begin with? You can cage their body but not their mind, because their mind never experienced moral discomfort. And that is when the interviews take on a strange kind of weight. You find yourself talking to someone who committed what the world calls evil, but who does not believe evil is real. Say pain, and they think of their pain. Say loss, and they think of their freedom. Say victim, and they think of their inconvenience. A psychopath does not live in a shared emotional world. They live in a self-contained one, where only their feelings, their survival, their desires matter. Everyone else is a usage, a tool, an obstacle, a temporary function. Some people ask, Didn't they feel anything at all? The answer is yes, but not what you expect. They feel irritation, boredom, hunger, excitement, ego, entitlement. What they don't feel is the one emotion that prevents cruelty: empathy. And when empathy is removed, everything else becomes possible. That's why many of them were not feared by the people around them before the crime. They didn't rage. They didn't threaten. They didn't show explosive emotion. They didn't look dangerous. They looked quiet, polite, reserved, controlled. But silence is not the opposite of violence. Sometimes it is the preparation for it. The world keeps waiting for monsters to reveal themselves. Psychopaths don't reveal. They blend. They aren't unpredictable. They're unrestrained. And that is a far bigger danger, because it means the only real protection against them is recognition before damage happens. But how do you recognize something that imitates humanity better than humanity recognizes itself? That is the question that keeps Berry-Dee returning to these cold rooms and steel tables. Not to understand murder, but to understand emptiness disguised as a person. Because if the world keeps mistaking emotional imitation for emotional truth, we will keep trusting the wrong people. Right up until the moment they decide someone else's existence is optional. There is a silence that follows these interviews, not the silence of peace but the silence of realization. Once you've listened to a killer describe murder without emotional fracture, you stop thinking of evil as something dramatic. You start seeing it for what it truly is in its highest form: calm. Not rage. Not heat. Not madness. Calm. Because when someone can end a life and feel nothing, the absence itself becomes the loudest sound in the room. That is what stays with Berry-Dee long after the door closes. Not the horror of the crime, but the comfort with which it was recalled. The ease. The clarity. The smoothness of the memory. When someone can describe death the same way they might describe fixing a car or rearranging furniture, you realize you are not sitting across from someone who lost control. You are sitting across from someone who never needed control in the first place, because nothing inside them was fighting back. And that is the part the world still resists. A psychopath doesn't struggle against cruelty. They glide through it. Even when they face consequences, prison, trial, public exposure, they don't reflect on what they did. They reflect on what they lost. They don't see murder as a wound they inflicted. They see it as a plan that didn't fully work out. That is why so many of them stay psychologically intact in isolation. They don't replay the victim's final moments. They replay their own mistakes. To them, the crime wasn't devastating. The interruption was. Some killers even enjoy revisiting the memory not because they miss the violence but because they miss the power. They miss the moment the world bent to their will. They miss the way someone else's life became weightless in their hands. The victim is gone, but the killer's ego is still alive, feeding on the past as if it were a trophy. Others simply shrug off questions about remorse. What's the point? It already happened. That's not denial. That's reality to them. Once an event is over, it holds no emotional continuation. The dead don't matter because they don't exist anymore. And it is in that sentence, they don't matter because they don't exist anymore, that the true structure of the psychopathic mind is revealed. They don't grieve the victim because grief requires recognizing the victim as human. The only life they mourn is their own, the one now spent behind walls. That is the sixth rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath does not feel the loss they create. They only feel the loss of benefit. And this is why many of them never become visibly broken in prison. In fact, some thrive. There are no emotional responsibilities. No expectation of empathy. No need to pretend love. The world finally reflects the structure of their internal reality, a world of rules, goals, hierarchies, and power. They don't miss freedom. They miss opportunity. Which leads to the most disturbing question of all. If they were released today, what would stop them from killing again? Most of them answer with terrifying honesty. Only the risk of getting caught. Not morality. Not regret. Not awakening. Just consequence. Because for a psychopath, life is not measured in right and wrong. It is measured in cost and reward. And once you understand that, you understand why society keeps losing to minds like these. We judge actions by morality. They judge actions by efficiency. We protect others out of empathy. They spare others only if useful. We see murder as unthinkable. They see it as an option. Not a last resort. Not an explosion. Just an option. And when life itself becomes optional in the mind of a human being, the real danger is no longer what they've done, but what they are still capable of doing. What haunts Berry-Dee isn't just the cruelty of the killers he interviews, it's the normality of their delivery. They speak about murder as if they were describing a scene from someone else's life, not their own. No shaking hands. No cracked voice. No tremor of regret. Their words are clean because their conscience is clean, not morally but mechanically. Nothing inside them was damaged by the act, because nothing inside them was wired to absorb emotional shock in the first place. They are fully aware of what they did. They just don't feel what they did. That is the difference most people cannot accept. We assume knowledge brings guilt. We assume awareness creates pain. But psychopaths prove that knowledge without conscience is just memory, and memory without empathy is just data. That is why so many of them can describe their crimes in perfect detail. Not because they are proud, but because there is no emotional static interfering with recall. While a normal person would be haunted by the smallest sensory memory, the scream, the final breath, the look in the victim's eyes, a psychopath recalls the same moment with the emotional clarity of a documentary frame. And yet, they always expect something from the listener. Respect. Fascination. Intellectual acknowledgement. They want to be seen not as killers but as exceptional. They turn their crimes into narratives not because they regret them, but because they want control over how the world remembers them. That is the seventh rule Berry-Dee discovers. A psychopath doesn't obsess over what they did, they obsess over how they are perceived. They don't fear judgment. They fear irrelevance. Even in prison they compete for psychological territory, attention from journalists, influence inside the inmate hierarchy, fan letters, documentaries, internet discussions. Anything that proves they still exist in other people's minds. Their crimes erased lives, now they want their crimes to cement theirs. This is why many of them talk so openly, not to confess but to curate legacy. They want their logic to be heard. Their mindset to be studied. Their motives to be dissected. Not because they care about truth, but because attention is the last form of power available to them. And the illusion is seductive. For a moment as they speak you almost start to believe what they want you to believe, that they are rare, intelligent, complex, deep. But the truth is far more simple and far more chilling. They aren't complex. They are missing what makes complexity possible, emotional depth. A psychopath's intelligence is often nothing more than emotional emptiness mistaken for clarity. Their calmness is not discipline, it's lack of conscience. Their confidence is not self-mastery, it's the absence of self-doubt. The world keeps calling them enigmatic, mysterious, unfathomable, because the world still refuses to accept that the thing we are searching for, a soul, a wound, a moral fracture, was never there. They are not puzzles. They are voids wearing personality. And the more Berry-Dee listens, the more one truth repeats. They don't talk about victims. They talk about events. They don't talk about lives they ended. They talk about decisions they made. Every story they tell is centered around themselves, their thinking, their control, their perspective. The victim only exists as a brief point of interaction, a momentary object in a story that never belonged to them. Because to a psychopath, a victim is not a person. A victim is a moment. And when the moment is over, the story continues, but only for one side. That is the horror beneath every interview. The killer walks away internally unchanged. The family never walks away from the loss. Two timelines split, one silent, one shattered. And the person responsible for that divide feels nothing. The deeper Berry-Dee goes into these encounters, the more he begins to notice the same cold architecture behind every story, a structure of thought built not from emotion but from self-interest. These killers don't see themselves as villains. They don't see themselves as tragic. They don't see themselves as damaged. They see themselves as separate. Set apart from the rest of humanity the same way a predator is set apart from prey. Not better. Not worse. Just different. And in their mind, it is we who are strange, not them. We are the ones who hesitate before harming someone. We are the ones who feel guilt long after an argument. We are the ones who lose sleep over the emotional weight of our actions. To them, those reactions are signs of weakness, emotional chains we willingly clasp to ourselves. They do not understand remorse the way we don't understand hunger in a being that never eats. Not because they refuse it, but because they've never felt the thing remorse is built from: connection. Many of them openly mock the idea of emotional morality. People cry over people they barely knew, one killer said. Why? Not aggressively. Not sarcastically. But genuinely confused. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to understand something alien to him: empathy. You could see it in the way he paused, expecting an explanation that would make sense to him. But there is no explanation that bridges that gap. You cannot explain color to someone who has never seen light. That is the eighth rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath doesn't reject empathy, they are incapable of experiencing it. And without empathy, morality becomes a myth, pain becomes irrelevant, and murder becomes nothing more than a change in circumstance. Some psychopaths tell their stories like lecturers, detached, analytical, emotionless. Others speak like entertainers, smirks, tone shifts, dramatic rhythm. But both versions serve the same goal: to maintain control over the meaning of what they did. They don't want you to feel sorry for the victim. They want you to feel something about them. Because as long as attention stays on the killer, the victim is buried twice, once in death and again in narrative. And this is why Berry-Dee refuses to let them shape the conversation. He interrupts. He redraws the focus. He forces the forgotten humanity back into the room. Not to provoke guilt, because guilt will not appear, but to shatter the illusion that the killer is the only person whose story matters. When he shifts the topic to the victim's life, the temperature in the room changes, not emotionally but strategically. The psychopath becomes restless, not sad, not shaken. Just irritated, like someone being dragged into a topic that has no relevance to them. Because in the mind of a psychopath, once a person stops serving a purpose, they stop existing. That absence, not hate, not rage, not insanity, is what makes their crimes so impossible for the average person to comprehend. We assume killing requires a storm of emotion. But for them it required no storm at all. Just a moment without resistance. No inner voice saying stop. No empathy saying this matters. No guilt waiting to punish them later. Nothing. That is the secret thread connecting every interview, every story, every moment Berry-Dee has spent staring into the calmest eyes he has ever seen. Psychopaths don't destroy people because they are overwhelmed by emotion. They destroy people because they are untouched by it. And once you fully understand that, once you absorb the truth that some humans are born without the psychological structure that bonds us to one another, the frightening question is no longer, why did they kill? The question becomes, how many like them walk through the world every day, not killing, not yet, simply waiting for the moment when nothing inside them says no? And the answer is the one society isn't ready to face. You don't notice them until after the damage is done. There's a certain kind of silence that follows the words of a psychopath. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of realization. You don't walk away thinking, how could anyone do this? You walk away thinking, they truly don't understand why what they did is wrong. Not because they're pretending, but because the emotional blueprint that would allow them to understand it simply doesn't exist inside them. That is when the illusion breaks. The illusion that everyone has a conscience, that guilt is automatic, that empathy is universal. We live in a world built on the assumption that people stop themselves from causing harm because it feels wrong. But psychopaths don't feel wrongness. They feel consequences. And if consequences disappear, so does restraint. One killer told Berry-Dee, I didn't feel anything before and I didn't feel anything after. It just happened and then life continued. That sentence, so simple, is more horrifying than any graphic detail, because it is the voice of a human being whose emotional world contains no history of the act, only a timeline of events. No guilt. No moral bruise. No internal scar. Just before. Then after. And that is the ninth rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath does not live with the memory of a murder, they live with the record of it. Memory and record are not the same. A memory has emotional gravity. A record is just stored information. That is why psychopaths can recall every detail with flawless clarity, not because they care but because there is no emotional interference. No guilt fogging the picture. No remorse blurring the edges. The mind remains clean because nothing inside it was damaged. This is what makes them so different from rage killers, passion killers, trauma killers. Those people might scream, break down, deny, weep, disconnect, because something in them collapses after the act. But in psychopathy there is no collapse. There is no before self and after self. The self does not fracture. The self remains intact. That is why they don't fear the past. They fear irrelevance in the present. The world still believes remorse is a natural consequence of hurting another person. But remorse is not natural. It is the offspring of empathy. Without empathy, guilt can't exist. And without guilt, the past has no moral weight. What's left is only calculation. A psychopath calculates. Did I mess up? Did I leave evidence? Did I choose the wrong victim? Would I do it differently? And those questions terrify the listener, not because they're cold but because they're precise. Violence doesn't disturb them. Failure does. That is the separation line between a human conscience and a predatory mind. A normal person's suffering comes from what they did to someone else. A psychopath's suffering, when it exists at all, comes from what was done to them. Take away their freedom, not their sleep. Take away their audience, not their appetite. Take away their power, and that's when you finally see discomfort. But even then it's not grief. It's inconvenience. Because a psychopath doesn't miss the people they hurt. They miss the power they had over them. That's why their stories are never about sorrow. They're about control lost, control desired, control remembered. The violence is not the emotional center of the act. The power is. And that is the truth most documentaries, courtrooms, and news reports refuse to say out loud. Psychopaths don't kill because they're broken. They kill because nothing inside them ever told them not to. And until society accepts that, we will keep waiting for killers to look like villains, instead of recognizing that the most dangerous ones are always the ones who never look dangerous at all. There comes a point in every interview where Berry-Dee no longer hears words. He hears structure. Not sentences, not stories, but the shape of the mind behind them. You start to notice what is missing more than what is spoken. There are no emotional pauses. No moral reflection. No tremor when describing a life taken. The voice stays flat, steady, unbroken, as if the killer is reading from a manual instead of recounting a moment where a human being stopped breathing. And that is when it hits you. They didn't lose their humanity. They never had the version of humanity you expected. This is what makes psychopathy so difficult for society to process, because we keep measuring them with tools that only work on people who feel. We ask, do you regret it? We expect remorse. But what you receive instead is confusion, not defensiveness but genuine confusion, as if you just asked them to regret stepping over a puddle. If something caused them no pain, why should they feel pain about it now? That is the difference between emotional morality and logical morality. We feel the wrongness. They only know others think it's wrong. And knowledge without empathy is just trivia. That is the 10th rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath doesn't believe in morality, they observe it in others. They know what words generate sympathy. They know what tone makes people trust them. They know what tears look like, how sorrow sounds, how apology is shaped. But they don't feel the emotion underneath those performances. They study emotion the way a pickpocket studies crowds, not to join them but to exploit them. Some do it for attention. Some do it for power. Some do it for pure stimulation. But all of them do it because emotion is a tool, not a truth. That is why psychopaths can appear so charismatic. Not because they are genuine but because they only express the emotions that benefit them. They skip the burdens. Empathy, guilt, hesitation, love with consequence. They imitate the parts of humanity that open doors. And the world rewards imitation. We reward confidence. We reward charm. We reward calmness under pressure. Psychopaths don't lack social skill. They weaponize it. Which is why, in many cases, the people closest to them had no idea. Not because the signs weren't there, but because the signs were the wrong kind. Society teaches us to fear anger, volatility, violence. But psychopaths don't rage. They perform. They manage. They calculate. They remain composed because emotion doesn't interrupt their thinking. And that's what makes them so effective at hiding. They don't look dangerous because they don't feel dangerous, not even to themselves. One victim's family member once said, "We trusted him because he seemed so normal." But normal was never the truth. Normal was a costume. A psychopath doesn't enter your life to connect. They enter to gain position. Emotional, social, psychological, or physical. And once you are no longer useful, they either discard you, or erase you. That's why their crimes don't feel explosive. They feel calculated. Not emotional storms, emotional voids with strategy. You don't hear, "I lost control." You hear, "I decided." And that word, decided, is the single most chilling word in every interview. Because it means murder wasn't an accident or a collapse or a mental spiral. It was a choice made without emotional consequence. And once you understand that, something inside you shifts forever. You stop thinking of evil as rage and start recognizing it as emptiness with intent. That is what Berry-Dee carries long after these interviews end, not the screams of victims, but the calm voices of those who made the screams necessary. The more time Berry-Dee spends inside these rooms, the more he realizes society keeps preparing for the wrong kind of threat. We fear the person who shouts, the person who snaps, the person who loses control in a burst of rage. But the killers he interviews don't lose control. They never needed control to begin with, because there was no emotional force inside them to restrain. They don't erupt, they execute. We imagine danger as loud. Psychopathy proves danger can also be silent. That silence is not peaceful. It is the silence of a mind that has no argument with itself. There is no emotional debate. No internal resistance. No moment where the act feels wrong. To them, the only issue is whether the act is useful. If murder serves a purpose, it becomes logical. If the victim is inconvenient, the removal feels justified. Not philosophically, pragmatically. You cannot appeal to their empathy. You cannot reach their conscience. You cannot introduce guilt into a system that has no slot for it. That is the 11th rule Berry-Dee learns. Psychopaths don't kill because they are emotionally overwhelmed. They kill because they are emotionally uninterrupted. And this is where society keeps failing. We keep trying to build solutions on the assumption that everyone has a conscience to activate, a heart to awaken, a moral engine to repair. But what do you repair in someone who never had that engine to begin with? You can punish action. But you cannot punish someone into empathy. Some killers even admit they studied emotions the same way others study a foreign language. One man said he learned how to look concerned by watching movies. Another memorized the tone of regret from true crime documentaries, not to understand it but to mimic it when necessary. You could hear the pride in their voice, not pride in their crime but pride in their ability to perform humanity convincingly. That's the part people forget. Psychopaths do not lack awareness. They lack participation. They know what love looks like. They do not feel love. They know what guilt sounds like. They do not experience guilt. They know what compassion requires. They do not feel compelled to offer it. And because they know how you work, they can control you long before you realize something is wrong. That's why victims rarely see it coming. Not because they're naive but because they're human, and humans instinctively assume other humans have inner limits. We assume everyone has a point they won't cross. A moment where the conscience kicks in. A moral barrier that cannot be overridden. But psychopaths prove something unsettling. Some people have no line to cross, only choices to make. And once you remove the line, violence isn't a breakdown. It's just another option on a list. So when people ask Berry-Dee, why do they do it? They expect a dramatic origin, a tragic wound, a psychological explosion. But the real answer is quiet and merciless. Because nothing inside them stopped them. No guilt to block the act. No empathy to scream during it. No remorse to punish them afterward. Just thought. Then action. Then continuation. That's why these interviews don't leave him with nightmares about the crimes. They leave him with something far heavier. The awareness that most people still believe morality is biological, when in reality, it is a luxury of the emotionally connected. And once you understand that, you stop seeing psychopaths as broken people. You start seeing them as complete, just in a way that has no place in the world we assume is shared. As the interviews accumulate, a darker truth starts to crystallize. Psychopaths do not fear what we fear and they do not value what we value. Freedom, connection, belonging, remorse. These are emotional currencies and they do not trade in emotion. They trade in control. They trade in benefit. They trade in advantage. And once a person stops being useful to them, that person stops being real in their internal world. That is what separates them from every other kind of criminal. A thief may steal out of need. A jealous lover may kill out of passion. A traumatized person may lash out from pain. But a psychopath does not act from storm, they act from vacuum. No emotional origin. No emotional consequence. Just a decision that feels as neutral to them as breathing. That is why they adapt so easily. Arrest does not break them. Courtrooms do not humble them. Prison does not transform them. They do not enter a cell thinking, "What have I done?" They enter thinking, "What can I still control from here?" Some become manipulators behind bars, moving people like chess pieces. Some become celebrities of evil, feeding on attention from the outside world. Some retreat into cold silence not out of guilt, but because silence gives them power in a place where everyone else gets loud. You cannot shame someone who feels no inner disgrace. You cannot reach someone who never had the wiring for moral reachability. That is the 12th rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath's punishment does not exist inside them, it exists around them. Take their freedom but their psychology remains untouched. Take their reputation but their self-perception stays inflated. Take their life and they leave the world with the same emotional weight they entered it with, none. Even when they speak of death, their own death, there is no existential fear. They don't fear moral judgment after life. They don't imagine a reckoning. They don't picture the faces of the people they hurt waiting to confront them. Their only concern is ending without significance. That is what terrifies them most. Not hell. Not karma. Not God. Not ghosts. Oblivion. A life forgotten means the power they once had evaporates. And so they do everything to stay relevant. Interviews, letters, books, confessions, lies, media manipulation, exclusive stories. It doesn't matter whether people admire them or despise them, as long as they are seen. Because in their world, attention is the closest thing to immortality. That is why psychopaths don't fear justice. They fear disappearance. They fear becoming unimportant, unseen, unspoken, unstimulating. They would rather be infamous than invisible. They would rather be remembered for horror than forgotten in quiet. And this is the part that shakes Berry-Dee the most. Not the murders but the realization that the killers don't care about murder nearly as much as we do. We see a life ended. They see an event completed. We see tragedy. They see finality. We feel outrage, sorrow, disbelief. They feel only boredom, irritation, or pride, depending on whether the story still benefits them. And so the world keeps trying to understand them through empathy, a tool that has no effect on minds that don't register it. We keep asking, how could someone do this? As if there must be a reason that makes emotional sense. But the most frightening truth is this. There is no emotional reason. There is only an emotional absence, and a decision made inside it. That is why psychopaths are not horror movie monsters. They are not storms. They are not demons. They are not even complicated. They are simplicity where there should have been depth. A silence where there should have been conflict. A yes, where every human instinct should have said no. And once you meet that silence face to face, not on paper, not in theory, but in a real room from a real mouth behind real eyes, you never think of danger the same way again. Because you realize, the world's deadliest predators are not the ones who lose control. They are the ones who never needed control to begin with. As he reflects on years of sitting across from killers, Berry-Dee realizes something most people never notice. Society doesn't just fear psychopaths, it misunderstands them. Not because they're too complex but because we keep searching for the wrong meaning. We expect tragedy. We expect pain. We expect a wound that explains the darkness. But psychopathy is not a story of wounds. It is a story of absence. And that absence terrifies us because it doesn't follow the emotional rules we live by. People want to believe that evil must feel evil. That cruelty must come with rage. That violence must leave a scar on the one who committed it. But the men Berry-Dee interviews don't feel stained, haunted, or broken. They feel unmoved. Even when they acknowledge the crime, they do it as though they were describing someone else's experience, not their own moral choice. That's why so many of these killers go unnoticed for so long. They don't walk around looking like danger. They walk around looking like nothing at all. Not dramatic. Not monstrous. Just emotionally flat. And flatness is rarely seen as a threat, until you learn what it allows. Emotional emptiness is not loud. It is efficient. A conscience slows a person down. A nervous system wired for empathy interferes with harm. A normal brain argues with itself before crossing a moral line. But a psychopath never has that argument. They never have that hesitation. They never fight themselves internally, because there's nothing inside to fight. That is the 13th rule Berry-Dee learns. Psychopathy is not emotional chaos. It is emotional simplicity. And simplicity is lethal when applied to power. When you speak with them, you start to notice how effortlessly they strip away the humanity of others, not with hatred but with indifference. The victim is always repositioned as something less than a person. A disruption. A weak link. A mistake in their plan. A resource. A threat. Or simply, someone who was there. And the way they say it, so calmly, is more horrifying than the act itself. Because they're not trying to shock you. They're not trying to confess. They're not trying to be understood. They're just explaining. And that tone, the tone of explanation, is what divides them from every other kind of killer. You hear no friction in their voice. No internal battle. No wait. Just clarity. The clarity of a mind that never formed the emotional wiring that would make murder psychologically unbearable. This is why psychopaths don't unravel after the crime. They don't drown in guilt. They don't spiral in nightmares. They don't develop trauma. Because trauma requires emotional injury. And they were never injured, not inside. Only their lifestyle was interrupted. Some even view capture as a temporary defeat, not a moral reckoning. You take away their freedom, not their worldview. You remove their choices, not their appetite for control. And still, society continues to comfort itself with the same lie. Psychopaths must be rare. But Berry-Dee knows better. They're not rare. They're just rarely recognized in time. Because most people don't look for the absence of empathy. They look for the appearance of aggression. They look for cruelty that looks like cruelty. But the truth is this. Evil is not always loud. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it thanks you. Sometimes it waits. Not every predator bears its teeth. Some simply never grow them, because they never needed them. The deeper Berry-Dee goes into the minds of these killers, the more he understands that society keeps looking for psychopathy in the wrong places. We search for it in explosive tempers, violent outbursts, unstable emotions, unpredictable behavior, but psychopaths don't malfunction emotionally. They lack emotion in the very places where morality is supposed to live. That isn't dysfunction. That is design. They don't hide their darkness behind charisma. They hide it behind normality. Not dramatic, not theatrical, not monstrous, just ordinary. Composed. Controlled. Because the most effective disguise in the world is not the mask of evil. It's the mask of nothing unusual. This is why people who knew them, neighbors, co-workers, girlfriends, even family, always say the same line after the truth comes out. He didn't seem like the type. But what is the type? A face twisted by rage? A man pacing in shadows? Someone who looks visibly dangerous? That image is a myth. The real threat walks through life unnoticed not because it blends into darkness, but because it blends into daylight. And this leads Berry-Dee to the 14th rule. Psychopaths don't hide their nature. The world simply doesn't look for it where it exists. We are trained to fear what looks unstable. Psychopaths look stable. We are trained to fear anger. Psychopaths stay calm. We are trained to fear people who snap. Psychopaths never snap, they decide. Even when they kill, it is not an eruption. It is an action. The same tone of voice they used to describe the weapon is the tone they used to describe the weather. Nothing inside them changed before or after the act. Because murder is not trauma to someone who feels no emotional cost. They don't replay the victim's face. They don't relive the scream. They don't feel the echo of death. Because death is not emotional to them. It is removal. And once the removal is complete, the victim becomes a past event. Not a person. Not a life. Not a presence lost. Just a moment. A solved inconvenience. A memory with no temperature. That is the part most people can't process. Not the cruelty but the coldness. We expect killers to be haunted. But a psychopath is never haunted by the lives they ended, only by the freedom they lost. They don't say, I ruined a life. They say, I got caught. They don't say, I wish I could take it back. They say, I wish I'd done it better. They don't regret the murder. They regret the mistake. And that is when you understand the true psychological gap, not between good and evil but between humanity and absence of humanity. Because the worst lies ever told about psychopaths were not told by them. They were told by us, when we assumed that everyone must feel something inside. But some people don't. And they don't miss what they're missing. They don't look into a mirror searching for a soul. They don't feel broken. They don't feel inhuman. They don't feel anything missing at all. Because inside the mind of a psychopath, there is no wound. There is no moral bruise. There is no fracture. There is only space, clean, unbothered space, where things like guilt, empathy, and emotional consequence were never installed. And once you realize that, you stop asking, how could they do it? Because the real question, the one that sends a quiet chill through the room, is, what would stop someone who feels nothing from doing anything? At some point in these conversations, Berry-Dee realizes the real threat is not the violence a psychopath commits, it's the mindset that allowed it so effortlessly. You start to see that the danger doesn't come from rage, darkness, or madness. It comes from emotional neutrality applied to human life. Because when a person feels no bond to the existence of others, your life is not sacred to them. It is optional. That is what makes psychopathy so fundamentally different from every other type of criminality. Rage can be calmed. Trauma can be treated. Impulse can be controlled. But what do you treat in someone who never felt the thing you're trying to awaken? You cannot repair a conscience that never existed. You can only contain the body that carries the emptiness. And that is the 15th rule Berry-Dee learns. Psychopaths don't need healing. They need limits they cannot escape. Because empathy will not stop them. Morality will not stop them. Guilt will not stop them. Only consequences will. Even then, the consequence is not emotional, it is logistical. Prison doesn't make them feel sorry. Prison makes them feel interrupted. Their internal state doesn't change. Their environment does. But the mind, the core, remains unbothered. Some use prison as a stage, others as a laboratory. Some become manipulators inside the walls. Some become silent kings of psychological control. Some simply wait, not for freedom but for relevance. And this is the part most people will never understand. For a psychopath, attention is oxygen. Even if they can't control the world physically anymore, the ability to control the narrative is still a form of dominance. They don't need sympathy. They don't need forgiveness. They just need to matter. That is why some of them become experts at confessing without ever feeling remorse. They will explain their crimes with intelligence. They will analyze their motives with clarity. They will go into perfect detail, not to honor the truth, but to feed the ego that still wants to be the center of the story. You can almost feel it when they speak. The subtle pride, the desire to be studied, the quiet hunger to be remembered. They don't care if the world hates them. Hate is still proof of existence. Hate is still attention. Hate is still energy directed toward them. Because in the mind of a psychopath, even negative attention is a form of victory. And that is what terrifies Berry-Dee, not their coldness, but their need to be the architect of how their evil is understood. They don't want to be seen as monsters. They want to be seen as rare minds. They want to be admired for their clarity, their intellect, their control. But the truth is this: they are not brilliant. They are not enlightened. They are not elevated above humanity. They are hollow, and they turn that hollowness into a weapon. And when you accept that, when you strip away every romanticized label, every myth of dark genius, every cinematic illusion, what remains is not a mastermind, but a human organism missing the one ingredient that makes human life sacred: shared feeling. They are not deranged wolves. They are not cursed minds. They are not extraordinary. They are the simplest horror the world has ever made. A person who can cause destruction and walk away emotionally untouched. And once you see that kind of mind up close, truly without filter, without fiction, you stop asking how many psychopaths have killed. You start asking how many haven't yet. Because the only thing that separates a functioning psychopath from a murderer is whether killing ever becomes useful. Not moral. Not emotional. Just practical. And that is the kind of danger no one is prepared to detect, because we are still looking for the wrong signs. We wait for anger instead of absence. We wait for rage instead of indifference. We wait for chaos instead of calculation. But the most dangerous predator is not the one who loses control. It's the one who never needed control to begin with. The longer Berry-Dee studies these minds, the clearer the pattern becomes. The world keeps preparing for emotional evil, while the most dangerous evil is emotionless. We expect killers to be driven by something: hatred, jealousy, rage, revenge, because those emotions are familiar to us. We can track them. We can recognize them. But the killers he interviews are not driven by emotion at all. They are driven by absence, and absence leaves no warning signs. A normal person's internal world is full of friction. We feel conflict before doing harm. We feel the weight of another person's pain. We feel guilt when we cross a line. A psychopath feels none of this. No internal guilt. No emotional resistance. No moral tension. So when they are faced with a situation where violence is useful or satisfying or simply interesting, there is nothing inside them that rises up and says, "Stop." No inner voice. No shame. No empathy. No echo. And when you understand that, murder no longer looks like a breaking point. It looks like a choice that had no internal cost. That is the 16th rule Berry-Dee learns. A psychopath doesn't need a motive that makes sense to you. They only need a moment that makes sense to them. And because they feel nothing, they can wait. They can watch. They can calculate. They can mimic emotions for months, even years, never revealing their true psychological weather. Because they don't feel, they simulate. They watch how you react to kindness. They watch how you respond to charm. They watch your emotional logic. And once they understand it, they learn how to use it. That is why so many victims describe them as perfectly normal, gentle, kind, calm, attentive. Not because the killer was hiding rage, but because there was no rage to hide. There was only strategy. To a psychopath, emotions are not something to experience. They are something to study and imitate. And once they've learned the imitation well enough, the world will label them likable, trustworthy, confident, well-spoken. We mistake emotional emptiness for emotional control. We mistake lack of fear for strength. We mistake lack of guilt for self-assurance. We mistake mental stillness for maturity. And that is how they walk through life undetected, not because they're invisible but because they're interpreted incorrectly. We think confidence means safety. We think calmness means goodness. We think politeness means empathy. We think intelligence means conscience. But psychopaths prove none of those are true. Because when the moment comes, when someone becomes disposable or obstructive or simply no longer useful, they don't snap. They decide. And that is the real nightmare, not the scream of violence but the silence before it, when the killer is still smiling, still calm, still calculating, still gathering the last pieces of control before acting without hesitation. That is why people always say afterward, there were no signs. There were signs, but the world was trained to look for the wrong ones. We look for emotional instability, Psychopaths are emotionally stable. We look for anger. Psychopaths feel no anger before killing. We look for guilt afterward. Psychopaths don't feel guilt afterward. And so the only moment when most people finally recognize the predator is the moment right after it's too late. Because by the time a psychopath shows you who they truly are, they are no longer acting. They are doing. The most unsettling truth Berry-Dee uncovers is that society keeps searching for evil in emotion, anger, jealousy, hatred, when the most lethal evil is born from emotional absence. We think a killer must feel something intense before destroying a life. But the people he interviews don't feel too much. They feel nothing at all. And it's not the presence of darkness that makes them dangerous, it's the absence of humanity. That is why they never break. That is why they never crumble. That is why they never snap. You cannot snap something that was never bent. We keep expecting killers to behave like damaged humans. But a psychopath is not a damaged human, they are a deficient one. They are not drowning in emotion. They are walking across a dry floor where emotion never existed. We expect the act of killing to leave a wound inside them. But how can there be a wound where there is no internal flesh to tear? That is why therapy fails. That is why remorse never arrives. That is why understanding them does not change them. And that is why punishment does not transform them. Because you cannot fix the absence of what never existed. A conscience is not a skill. Empathy is not philosophy. Morality is not logic. They are feelings, and psychopaths are born without the emotional depth required to access them. That is the 17th rule Berry-Dee learns. Psychopaths don't become killers because something broke inside them. They become killers because nothing inside them resisted it. So when people try to analyze their crimes and ask questions like, what made him so cold? What event turned him into this? What pain shaped his violence? They are already misunderstanding the foundation. Psychopathy is not shaped. It is absent from the start. And once you understand that, something terrifying becomes clear. The same mind that kills without feeling can also live without feeling. Hold relationships without feeling. Build trust without feeling. Make promises without feeling. Smile without feeling. Because feeling is not part of their internal world. Only simulation is. And simulation is enough. Enough to fool a partner. Enough to fool a friend. Enough to fool an employer. Enough to fool a courtroom. Enough to fool a jury. Enough to fool everyone, right up until the moment when empathy was required and nothing inside them answered. That is why psychopaths are not just killers. They are absorbers, of trust, of time, of safety, of belief. They take and take, not because they are greedy, but because they do not register the thing they take as belonging to a person. And that is the most chilling transformation. Once a victim has no emotional existence in the mind of a predator, the act of killing them is no longer moral or immoral. It becomes neutral. Not dark. Not evil. Just a decision. And when murder becomes just a decision, the only barrier left is risk. Not conscience. Not guilt. Not empathy. Just risk. Which means the only thing stopping them is the world catching them. That is the story inside every interview Berry-Dee has ever walked into. Not why did they kill? But why wouldn't they? And that question, that quiet, horrifying question, is the one society is not ready to face. Because the truth is not that psychopaths are rare. The truth is that they can remain invisible until usefulness becomes opportunity, and opportunity becomes action. And when action finally arrives, it doesn't feel like rage. Feels like nothing. By the time Berry-Dee finishes his long journey through interview rooms, prison gates, cold tables, and unblinking eyes, one truth has carved itself so deeply into him that it can no longer be ignored. The greatest danger in the world is not the person who feels too much. It is the one who feels nothing at all. Because emotion, even dark emotion, is still a tether to humanity. Fear can stop violence. Guilt can undo cruelty. Empathy can interrupt impulse. Remorse can break a cycle. But when you meet a mind with none of those breaks, none of those echoes, none of those collisions between action and conscience, you are not looking at someone who slipped into evil. You are looking at someone for whom evil was never emotionally defined in the first place. And that is the final rule Berry-Dee learns. The truth at the center of every interview, every confession, every unsettling calm. Psychopaths don't destroy because they are overcome by darkness. They destroy because there was never light inside them to begin with. They don't regret the life they ended. They regret the freedom they lost. They don't replay the victim's final moment. They replay the moment they made a mistake. They don't feel haunted. They feel interrupted. To them, the victim was never a universe of memories, dreams, laughter, childhood, love, and future. The victim was only the space between the psychopath and what they wanted. And once that space was cleared, the story moved on. Only not for the people left behind. That is the wound society keeps reopening, not by what these killers did, but by what we keep refusing to accept. We think everyone has a conscience because we need to believe morality is a default part of being human. But morality is not universal. Conscience is not guaranteed. Empathy is not built in. And when you meet a person who lives outside of those internal laws, you realize the truth is far colder than the myths we comfort ourselves with. Some people don't feel the horror of what they've done, because the horror was never theirs to feel. They don't turn evil. They simply act without emotional cost. They don't become monsters. They remain what they always were. A human face with no human anchor inside. Not broken. Not tortured. Not misunderstood. Just empty. And when emptiness is given intelligence, charm, opportunity, and no inner resistance, the world calls the result evil. But that word, Berry-Dee realizes, is only a label we use when we don't want to face the simpler truth. The most dangerous predator on earth is not the one who hates you. It is the one who doesn't care whether you live or die, and never did. No hatred. No passion. No conflict. Just indifference. Just decision. Just continuation. And so the real warning is not about the past, it is about the invisible present. Because psychopaths don't walk through life looking like predators. They walk through life feeling nothing, and waiting for a moment when nothing inside them says no. And that moment, quiet, calculated, unhurried, is all it takes to end a life. That is why Berry-Dee doesn't leave these interviews afraid of what a psychopath did. He leaves afraid of what a psychopath can do again. Because the only true barrier between them and their next victim is whether the world stops mistaking normality for conscience. Because nothing, not intelligence, not charm, not calmness, not confidence, ever reveals who they are. Only one thing does. The absence of empathy. And once you understand that, the final question is no longer, how do we stop them? The question becomes, how do we live in a world where some people walk among us with no internal reason not to destroy, only external reasons not to get caught? And with that realization, the real horror is not the psychopath behind bars. It's the one who hasn't needed to kill yet. And the silence they carry inside them, waiting.